You're making a mistake." The words cut through the tension like a blade. Every head in the courtroom turned, every breath held. The judge, the jury, the prosecution, frozen. At the center of the room stood a boy, no older than 10, small, unassuming, out of place. But his voice carried an authority far beyond his years. The judge's gavel hovered in the air, her command to remove that child caught in her throat. The prosecutor, a man who had built his career on airtight cases, narrowed his eyes. The defense attorney, who had spent months fighting a losing battle, suddenly sat straighter, and the defendant, the man everyone believed to be a killer, stared at the boy with something close to horror. "He didn't do it." The boy's voice was firm. "You're about to send the wrong man to prison." Murmurs swept through the room. The judge finally found her voice. "Who are you?" The boy took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm the only person in this room who knows the truth." The whispers turned into chaos. Journalists scrambled for their notepads. The jury exchanged glances. The cameras clicked furiously. The judge slammed her gavel. "Enough! Bailiff, remove—" "If you throw me out," the boy interrupted, his voice rising above the noise, "you'll never find the real killer." Silence. The tension in the room shifted. The case was seconds away from being closed. A guilty verdict was all but guaranteed. And now, one boy had changed everything. The question wasn't whether he was telling the truth. The question was, who didn't want him to? Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from. If you believe in justice and truth, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Ethan Miller was not supposed to be in that courtroom, 10 years old, a kid from a small town where nothing ever happened. The kind of boy who rode his bike until the streetlights came on and ate too much pizza on Friday nights. But Ethan had a problem. He saw things. Not in the way adults ignored, but in the way that made people uncomfortable. He noticed the way someone's hands fidgeted when they lied. The way a person's eyes darted when they were hiding something. The way the world whispered secrets in plain sight, if only you paid attention. His mother called him an old soul. His teacher said he had too much imagination. But Ethan knew better. That's why he was here, because what he saw wasn't imagination. It was real. And if no one listened, an innocent man would go to prison. It started 3 months ago. A summer afternoon. The sun high, the air thick with heat. Ethan had been riding his bike through the park the same way he always did when something caught his attention. A man and a woman near the lake, arguing. At first it didn't seem like much. Adults fought all the time. But something about this was different. The way the man's shoulders were tense, his eyes scanning the area. The way the woman stepped back, shaking her head, refusing to go with him. Ethan slowed his bike. The man grabbed the woman's wrist. She pulled away. Then, he forced her into the car. It was quick, too quick. By the time Ethan fully processed what he was seeing, the car was gone, disappearing down the road. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt afraid. Because deep in his gut, he knew. He had just witnessed something terrible. A week later, he saw the man's face again. On the news. His name was Lucas Hart, and he had been arrested for the murder of his girlfriend, Alyssa Green. The news anchor spoke with certainty. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses heard them arguing the night she disappeared. His fingerprints were found on her belongings. He had no alibi. The entire town believed he was guilty, except Ethan, because Alyssa Green had dark hair. And the woman Ethan saw being forced into the car that day, she was blonde. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe his memory was playing tricks on him. But the image haunted him. The way the man's hands had clenched, the way the woman had resisted, the look in her eyes. Fear. Desperation. Ethan tried to tell his mother. She brushed it off. "People argue all the time, sweetheart. It's probably nothing." But it wasn't nothing, because that night, Ethan had a nightmare. Alyssa's face, pale, lifeless, asking him, "Why didn't you say something?" He woke up drenched in sweat, and he knew he had to tell someone. But who would believe him? The trial began. His mother had jury duty, which meant she had to go to the courthouse. Ethan begged her to let him come along. "I'll be quiet, I promise," he said. She sighed. "All right, but you have to sit in the back. No wandering, no talking." Ethan nodded, but he had no intention of staying silent, because this was his chance, and no matter what it took, he was going to stop this trial, because Lucas Hart wasn't a murderer, and if Ethan didn't speak up now, the real killer would get away with it. The moment Ethan shouted, the trial unraveled. The judge ordered the bailiff to remove him, but something in her expression wavered. The defense attorney, who had spent the last few weeks watching his client sink deeper into a guilty verdict, saw a crack in the case. The prosecutor, so close to winning, now had a problem he didn't expect. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Ethan didn't care about any of that. He had one chance, one moment to make them listen. "Lucas Hart didn't kill Alyssa Green," he said, his voice shaking but steady, "because I saw something no one else did." The judge studied him. Then, for the first time since the trial began, she hesitated. "Take him to my chambers," she said. And just like that, Ethan was no longer just a boy in the courtroom. He was a witness. Inside the judge's chambers, Ethan sat in a chair too big for him. The judge leaned forward. "I need you to understand something. This is a murder trial. A man's life is at stake. If you are lying or wasting this court's time—" "I'm not lying." He told them everything. The park, the argument, the blonde woman, the way the man shoved her into the car. The defense attorney leaned in, taking notes. The prosecutor's face was unreadable. Then came the question Ethan had been dreading. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Ethan looked down. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." The judge's gaze was sharp. "And why do you think this woman wasn't Alyssa Green?" "Because Alyssa had dark hair." Silence. The prosecutor finally spoke. "Do you remember the car?" Ethan nodded. "It was dark blue. The back bumper had a dent. I remember because I thought it looked like someone had kicked it." The defense attorney's eyes flickered. "Lucas drives a silver car." The judge inhaled sharply. The room shifted. The case, once airtight, was suddenly full of cracks, but Ethan's words alone weren't enough. A single memory wasn't proof. The prosecutor argued it could be a coincidence, a misunderstanding, a child's imagination. So Ethan had to find evidence. And that meant going back to where it all started. The park. That night, long after his mother had gone to sleep, Ethan snuck out. His bike tires whispered against the pavement as he pedaled toward the park, the air thick with summer heat. The swings swayed slightly in the wind. The lake reflected the moon in broken ripples. He stood at the same spot he had that day. He closed his eyes, replayed the memory. The man, the woman, the car. Then, something new, something he hadn't noticed before. A glint, half buried in the dirt near the path. Ethan knelt down, his fingers digging into the cool earth. When he pulled his hand back, something small and metallic lay in his palm. A sunflower keychain. It was scratched, worn, but unmistakable. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, because he had seen this keychain before. Alyssa Green had one just like it. Ethan wasn't alone. A twig snapped behind him. His heart slammed against his ribs. He turned, expecting to see a late-night jogger, maybe a stray dog, but instead, a shadow moved between the trees, watching, waiting, then footsteps, getting closer. Ethan bolted. He grabbed his bike, pedaled faster than he ever had before, his breath burning in his lungs. He didn't stop until he reached home, his hands shaking as he locked the door behind him. He ran to his room, gripping the keychain so tightly it left indentations in his palm. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. Because Ethan wasn't the only one who knew the truth. And now, someone wanted to make sure he never told it. The next morning, Ethan brought the keychain to the defense attorney. It was the first real piece of evidence. The prosecution dismissed it. Could belong to anyone. But Ethan wasn't giving up. Because now he had proof Alyssa had been in the park that day. And if she was there, that meant Lucas Hart wasn't the last person to see her alive. That night, an email arrived. The subject line, "Drop it." The message, "You don't know what you're getting into. Stop asking questions." Attached was a photo. Ethan's stomach turned. It was a picture of his house, taken from the street. Recently, someone was watching him. And if he didn't stop, they would do more than just watch. Ethan barely slept that night. The email was burned into his mind. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone wanted him to stop. But Ethan had made up his mind. He wasn't stopping. If anything, he was more certain than ever. The next morning, he called the defense attorney. "I need to talk to you." The attorney hesitated. "Ethan, I appreciate your courage, but the court isn't going to overturn an entire case because of a keychain. What if I can prove who was really there that day?" Silence. Then, "Meet me at my office in an hour." Ethan never made it. He had barely left the house when he saw it. A car, dark blue, parked across the street. The same car, the one from the park, the one with the dent in the back bumper. His breath caught. His heart pounded against his ribs. The driver's side window rolled down. And that's when he saw him. A man, mid-30s, sharp jawline, dark eyes, and worse, he was looking directly at Ethan. Ethan turned and ran. He didn't think, didn't look back. His legs burned as he sprinted toward the alley behind his house. His lungs ached. His mind raced. Footsteps pounded behind him. He wasn't imagining it. Someone was chasing him. He darted around a corner, pressed himself against the wall of a garage, and held his breath. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. Ethan didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the sound of a car door slamming shut, an engine roaring to life. A few moments later, the car was gone. Ethan's hands were shaking. His legs felt weak, but he knew. This wasn't a warning anymore. Someone wanted him gone. He made it to the attorney's office an hour late. The man was pacing when Ethan stumbled in. "What the hell happened to you?" "They're watching me." Ethan's voice was breathless. "And I know who it is." The attorney frowned. "Ethan, slow down. Kyle Becker." The name fell from his lips before he even fully processed it. The defense attorney blinked. "Alyssa's ex-boyfriend? It was him in the park that day. I'm sure of it. He was the one forcing a woman into the car." The attorney grabbed his laptop and started typing furiously. "Kyle Becker was never a suspect." "Exactly." A beat of silence. Then the attorney turned the screen toward Ethan. "You need to see this." It was an old social media post, a picture of Kyle, taken a few days before Alyssa disappeared. And in the background, the dark blue sedan, with a dent in the rear bumper. Ethan felt like he couldn't breathe. "We need to take this to the judge." The attorney nodded. "We're running out of time." That night, another email arrived. No words, no threats, just a picture, taken through Ethan's bedroom window. Ethan barely had time to react before the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. Someone was inside. His mother screamed. Ethan grabbed his phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. "Someone broke in! We need help!" Footsteps thundered down the hall. His mother's voice was muffled, pleading, terrified. Ethan grabbed the first thing he could, a lamp, and held it in his hands, his heart racing. Then, silence. The front door slammed shut. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty. No sign of the intruder, except for one thing, the sunflower keychain, lying in the middle of Ethan's bedroom floor, as if someone had left it there on purpose. The police took Ethan and his mother into protective custody. The next morning, Ethan walked into the courtroom under armed guard. The trial was still in session. The prosecution was making their final argument. And then, the defense attorney stood. "Your Honor, we have new evidence." The prosecutor sighed dramatically. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defense is grasping at straws. A witness saw Alyssa Green the day she disappeared." The room went still. The judge narrowed her eyes. "Go on," the attorney motioned to the bailiff. "Let the witness take the stand." The doors opened, and Ethan stepped forward. A murmur spread through the room. "This is ridiculous," the prosecutor said. "He's a child. A child who saw something you didn't." Ethan climbed into the witness chair, gripping the wooden arms to keep his hands from shaking. "Tell the court what you saw." He told them everything: the argument, the woman, the car, the man. And then he said the name. Kyle Becker. A hush fell over the courtroom. Then the defense attorney set a laptop on the table and turned it toward the judge. "This is a photo of Kyle Becker, a few days before Alyssa Green disappeared, taken in front of his car." The image flashed onto the screen: the dark blue sedan, the dent in the bumper. The judge's expression changed. The prosecutor shifted in his chair, and then, from the back of the courtroom, a noise, a sudden scraping of a chair, a man standing up, Kyle Becker. His face had drained of color. Then he turned and bolted for the door. But the bailiffs were faster. They tackled him before he made it 3 steps, and just like that, the real killer had finally been caught. The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed her gavel, demanding order, but the chaos was uncontrollable. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, and the jury sat in stunned silence. Kyle Becker struggled against the bailiffs, his face contorted in rage and desperation. "This kid doesn't know what he's talking about," he yelled. "You can't prove anything." But it was too late. The defense attorney held up a stack of documents. "Actually, we can." Kyle froze. "We pulled his phone records. The night Alyssa disappeared, he made 3 calls to a number registered under an alias, one that we traced back to an abandoned property outside town." The prosecutor's confidence evaporated. "Additionally," the attorney continued, "Ethan's testimony gave us reason to dig deeper. This morning, officers searched that property. A tense silence filled the courtroom. And they found something." The attorney turned to the judge. "Would you like to hear what it was, Your Honor?" The judge's gaze was steely. "Proceed." The defense attorney took a breath. "They found Alyssa Green's missing purse, her phone, and traces of blood in the trunk of a car that matches the one Ethan described." A collective gasp spread through the room. Kyle Becker's mouth opened, then closed. The weight of the evidence crushed him. His face paled as reality set in. The case was over. Ethan sat still in the witness chair, his pulse hammering in his ears. For months, he had carried the truth alone. For months, no one had listened. Now, the world knew. The judge turned to the jury. "Due to new evidence, this trial cannot proceed. The verdict is now under reconsideration." For Lucas Hart, the falsely accused man, the words hit like a thunderclap. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of injustice lifting. He was free. An hour later, Ethan sat outside the courthouse with his mother. She hadn't said much, not since everything unraveled. She sat beside him, staring at the ground, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, she spoke. "You could have been killed." Ethan swallowed. He knew that. He had thought about it every single day since the moment he stood up in that courtroom. But then his mother turned to him, her eyes shining with something that wasn't fear, something deeper. "But you did the right thing." Ethan exhaled, the weight in his chest finally easing. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. because for the first time since this all started, justice had won. The next morning, the headlines told the story the world never saw coming. Murder trial shattered by young witness. 10-year-old boy exposes real killer in court. Kyle Becker arrested after startling testimony from child witness. Ethan didn't read them. He was too tired, too drained from everything he had been through. But outside, the world was buzzing. Reporters camped in front of his house. News stations replayed the footage of his testimony over and over again. Everyone wanted to hear from the boy who changed the case. But Ethan didn't want to talk. He just wanted to forget. Because the truth was, he had been lucky. If Kyle Becker had been just a little faster, if the police had been just a little slower, if Ethan had hesitated for even a second, this could have ended differently. That night, as the house finally quieted, Ethan sat on his bed, staring at the small, worn sunflower keychain on his nightstand. The thing that started it all. The thing that nearly got him killed. His mother knocked softly on the door. "You okay?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. She walked in and sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, "Not everyone would have done what you did, Ethan." He picked up the keychain, rolling it between his fingers. "I didn't want to. I just had to." His mother smiled faintly, brushing his messy hair back. "That's what makes you different." Ethan didn't know if he felt brave, or heroic, or even relieved. But he did feel one thing. He had done what was right, and that was enough. The truth isn't always easy to tell. Sometimes it's dangerous. Sometimes it's ignored. And sometimes it puts you in more trouble than you ever imagined. But one thing remains constant. The truth matters. Ethan Miller was just a kid. No badge, no authority, no power. Yet he saw something no one else did. And when it mattered most, he spoke up. He didn't wait for someone else to do it. He didn't let fear stop him. Because if he had, an innocent man would have spent his life behind bars, and the real killer would have walked free. Now we ask you, what would you have done? If you saw something that no one else did, if you held the key to the truth, would you have spoken up? Or would you have stayed silent? Tell us in the comments below. And if you believe in stories that challenge what's possible, stories of courage, justice, and truth, subscribe. Because sometimes the smallest voice can change everything, and you won't want to miss the next story that proves it.